A stale breeze drifted through the high-ceilinged apartment as Hannah Dalton stood by the window, squinting at the overcast sky. The late afternoon light fell in grey, uneven strips through the parted curtains, illuminating a living room that felt emptier than usual. Stacks of unpaid bills sat on the cluttered coffee table, dwarfed by a worn plush giraffe, a stray toy belonging to her son, Oliver. She ran her fingers through her dark, shoulder-length hair, releasing a muted sigh that no one else was around to hear. 3 months ago, she had been laid off from her position at a local nursing facility after a round of budget cuts. At 29 years old, she'd thought she had found stability, steady hours, health benefits, and just enough pay to keep Oliver clothed, fed, and safe. But all that vanished in a single meeting. She could still picture the apologetic face of her manager explaining that her position was simply not sustainable anymore. Hannah's attempts to piece together an income since then had felt like a never-ending scramble. She picked up part-time shifts as a home care aide for seniors, occasionally babysat children in her apartment building, and once even tried delivering groceries in her unreliable sedan. But the rent notice kept glaring at her from its perch on the fridge door, the red letters commanding her to settle the overdue amount before the end of the month. She had hardly a week left. Fear settled in her stomach like a stone. She glanced over to where Oliver's voice could be heard in the bedroom. He was humming quietly. He liked to pretend he was in a giant concert hall, his small voice echoing off the hallway walls. At 8 years old, he was a curious bundle of boundless energy and constant chatter. These days, though, he seemed to sense the tension that clung to every corner of their home. He no longer asked for the fancy cereals or the occasional fast food treat. He noticed when his mother's eyes looked tired, or when she lingered too long over a letter she couldn't afford to mail because even postage felt like a luxury. Oliver was too young to shoulder such awareness, but Hannah had never been able to hide her fears from him completely. A knock at the door disrupted her thoughts. Expecting the landlord, or worse, another final notice, she walked over, steeling herself. To her relief, it was the middle-aged neighbor from down the hall, Mrs. Chen. She held out an envelope with an apologetic smile. "Someone left this in my mailbox by mistake," Mrs. Chen explained, glancing down the corridor. "I think it's for you." She handed it over. "You're doing all right, dear." Hannah forced a polite smile, assuring the woman that she was fine, even as her heart threatened to hammer out of her chest. She closed the door, leaning against it for a moment before she tore open the nondescript envelope. Inside, there was a single folded sheet of paper. She read it once, twice, then a third time, her breath catching. Caregiver needed, large private residence, live-in position, no specialized degree required, high compensation for the right candidate, must be discreet, patient, and available immediately. No contact name was listed, only a phone number at the bottom. She sank onto the couch, the paper trembling in her hands. This was either some kind of scam or a desperate chance to fix everything. She blinked, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. A phone call, she decided, cost nothing. She could at least find out what the catch might be. Half an hour later, after mustering her courage and dialing the number, she found herself in a conversation with a cool, measured voice. It asked about her background in care work, her schedule, her ability to commit to an intense, round-the-clock position. No mention of specific tasks or the identity of the person needing care. Just a series of pointed questions that seemed aimed at testing her emotional resilience as much as her experience. By the end of it, she was invited, almost commanded, to come for an interview the following morning. She was left with an address in an affluent suburb an hour from the city, and a clear message. If you meet our criteria, the compensation will be sufficient to address any pressing concerns you might have. The speaker on the other end spoke with enough chilly assurance that Hannah's curiosity was piqued, despite her misgivings. After she hung up, she caught Oliver's eye from the hallway where he stood hugging his giraffe. She gave him a watery smile, crossing the room to gather him in her arms. The idea of being a live-in caretaker frightened her. It meant leaving Oliver behind, at least on certain nights, unless, by some miracle, the job allowed children. The advertisement had been maddeningly vague, but if the pay was truly as high as hinted, she might be able to keep them afloat until she found a more stable plan. She might finally stop feeling like she was clawing at the edges of a crumbling world. The next morning she left Oliver with Mrs. Chen, who graciously agreed to watch him for the day. Then she boarded a bus and watched as the city's shabby blocks gave way to sprawling neighborhoods with pristine lawns and manicured hedges. Eventually, the bus route ended, and she needed to walk the final stretch. The deeper she ventured, the more isolated the homes became, each perched like a fortress behind tall gates. At last, she approached the gate of the address she'd scribbled on a scrap of paper. It was flanked by towering stone pillars, crowned with wrought iron details that curled in elaborate patterns. A polished brass call box waited, discreet but imposing. She pressed the button with a trembling hand, half expecting to be turned away instantly. Instead, a short beep sounded, followed by the same calm, low voice from the phone. Yes. Her heart lurched. My name is Hannah Dalton. I'm here about the caregiving position. The gate slid open without another word, revealing a winding gravel driveway that split a well-tended garden. She stepped inside, conscious of how out of place she felt in her second-hand shoes and worn coat. The house itself was an architectural marvel, tall and looming, with a facade of pale stone that gleamed even on this overcast morning. As she made her way up the drive, the only sound was the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant rustle of wind through carefully groomed hedges. At the main entrance, a stone arch overhead gave her the eerie sensation of walking into another world. By the time she reached the heavy double doors, they swung open from within. A man in a tailored suit stood there, expression neutral. He introduced himself as Richard Dane, the estate manager, and indicated she should follow him inside. The foyer was cavernous, lit by a large chandelier that cast soft reflections onto a polished floor. She could smell fresh flowers somewhere in the distance, though she saw none in her immediate line of sight. Mr. Dane moved with practiced efficiency, guiding her through a corridor decorated with paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. The weight of wealth pressed in on her from every direction. They stopped before an ornate wooden door, which he opened to reveal a small study. A massive desk stood in one corner, loaded with neatly stacked files and a laptop. A tall window overlooked a rear lawn, and the furniture was upholstered in dark leather. The only occupant was a wiry woman with short hair, dressed in a crisp blouse and pants, who rose as they entered. She introduced herself as Dr. Collins, though she offered no specialty. Her gaze flicked over Hannah in a swift, appraising manner. Then she gestured to a chair. Hannah sank into it, trying not to fidget. The set of Dr. Collins's shoulders radiated quiet authority. "Your file from the agency is thin," the doctor remarked in a measured tone. "But you have some care experience in a nursing home. No advanced medical credentials?" Hannah shifted. "I was a CNA. I worked mostly with geriatric patients, some with mobility issues, some with dementia. I helped with daily tasks, feeding, bathing, administering medication under supervision." "And how do you handle stressful or emotionally charged situations?" Dr. Collins asked, steepling her fingers. "Do you have the patience to remain calm?" Hannah drew a breath, recalling tense nights at the nursing facility where she had to diffuse arguments between confused residents. I'm used to high-stress environments. Yes, I stay collected. Try to understand the root cause and diffuse any agitation if I can. Dr. Collins exchanged a subtle glance with Mr. Dane. That's a good start. You must understand that this position is unique. The person requiring care is a very private individual. A degenerative illness has limited his mobility. He doesn't want typical medical staff, so we've resorted to less conventional postings. We need someone who can respect his boundaries while still providing the support he needs. Hannah swallowed. The image of a proud, possibly embittered individual flashed in her mind. I'm willing to learn, to do whatever's required. Mr. Dane nodded in approval. You'll be required to live on the estate if you're hired. The pay is substantial, more than you'd typically see in a role like this. However, it also means you must be available at all hours and maintain strict confidentiality. Is that clear? The potential lifeline shimmered like a beacon in Hannah's thoughts. She nodded. I understand. Dr. Collins rose, smoothing her blouse. Very well. Let's see if our client agrees. She led Hannah out of the study and down a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, its walls lined with a gallery of dark portraits. The hush felt cathedral-like, broken only by the sound of their steps. Eventually, they reached a wide set of double doors at the far end. Inside was a room dominated by large windows overlooking a garden of clipped box hedges. In the center, an imposing bed stood on a raised platform flanked by a few plush chairs. Hannah almost missed the figure seated quietly near the windows, a tall silhouette in a wheelchair. He was turned away from them, posture rigid, as though straining to focus on the sunlight that struggled to pierce the late morning gloom. Mr. Dane cleared his throat. Sir, this is Hannah Dalton, the candidate we discussed. The figure didn't move for several seconds. Then he rotated the wheelchair with a slow, deliberate motion. Hannah's eyes took in the severe lines of his face, the hollows under his cheekbones. He couldn't be older than his mid-30s, but a certain weariness lingered in his gaze that made him seem older. Dark hair, neatly trimmed, contrasted with his pale skin. She noted the subtle trembling in his hands, as if he fought for control even over small movements. He glanced at her with an intensity that threatened to pin her to the spot. His voice emerged, deep but tinted with something akin to resignation. Another caretaker, Dr. Collins. Potentially, she answered. Her qualifications match what we need. He studied Hannah as if trying to divine the contents of her soul in the space of a few heartbeats. Finally, he exhaled a short, humorless laugh. Your name is Hannah? Yes, sir, she managed. She forced herself to hold his gaze, though it was unsettling, as if he saw right through any facade. He let silence stretch out, an invisible test of her nerves. Then he turned to Dr. Collins. You've explained the duties? In broad terms, the doctor replied. I thought it best to let you detail your preferences. The man's lips twisted into a faint frown. My preferences. He paused, voice faltering. It's not about preferences. It's necessity. Hannah, was it? He paused again, seeming to weigh the next words carefully. I have a degenerative neuromuscular disorder. It affects my ability to walk, sometimes even to hold certain objects. On good days, I can manage with minimal assistance. On bad days, I need help with nearly everything. Bathing, dressing, feeding myself. His jaw tensed, and Hannah sensed that admitting these vulnerabilities in front of strangers pained him more than any physical discomfort possibly could. She nodded slowly. I understand that this is difficult. A spark of bitterness lit his gaze. Do you? The staff here, Mr. Dane, Dr. Collins, does an admirable job of coordinating my therapy, medications, the day-to-day logistics of running the estate, but they can't provide the personal involvement needed when I'm at my weakest. I don't want a rotating team of strangers. I want one person. Consistency, I suppose. His tone turned sharply self-deprecating. Hannah swallowed, her throat dry. She had never been alone with the full responsibility for someone with such a condition. Yet she remembered the better days at the nursing facility, times she'd formed connections with patients who initially seemed closed off, resentful of their own dependence. "If you're willing to guide me, I'll do my best to meet your expectations," she said softly. He gave a small shake of his head as though frustrated. "It's not just about tasks. If I ask you to leave me alone, you do it. If I refuse medication, you let me be. If I lose my temper, I expect you not to lecture or judge. Discretion and loyalty, Ms. Dalton. That's what I need. Is that something you can handle?" Tension coiled in her chest. She thought of Oliver at home, the final notice from the landlord, the guilt that kept her awake at night. She would do nearly anything to secure their future. "Yes, I can handle it." He exhaled, shifting his weight in the chair, knuckles whitening on the armrests as if the movement caused him pain. "I suppose we'll find out." Dr. Collins nodded, stepping forward. "We should finalize the agreement. Ms. Dalton, if you accept, you'll begin as soon as possible." Hannah took a moment to breathe. The gravity of this role pressed down on her, but she saw no other path. "I accept," she said, voice steady. Mr. Dane inclined his head. "Very good. I'll have your quarters prepared. Shall we say you'll move in within the next 48 hours? She hesitated. Oliver's face flashed in her mind, and she forced herself to ask the question gnawing at her. "What about my child? He's 8. If this is live-in, I need to know if there's any possibility." "We have no arrangement for a child on the premises," Mr. Dane cut in smoothly but not unkindly. "This environment is unsuitable for that at present. The role is demanding. You'd have very limited time for other responsibilities. The contract does not account for dependents." Hannah's stomach dropped, but she managed a curt nod. "I see." With no child allowance, it meant she'd have to shuffle Oliver between neighbors and acquaintances and try to see him whenever the job might grant her an off day, if such a thing even existed. The desperation she felt was enough to steel her nerves. She had run out of alternatives. Dr. Collins placed a folder in Hannah's hands. "Sign these and leave them with Mr. Dane before you go. Pack whatever you need. We'll see you in 2 days." The man in the wheelchair turned away, rolling silently back to the window, dismissing them as though he'd grown tired of the conversation. Hannah studied his rigid spine for a moment, unsure what to make of the swirl of emotions that threatened to engulf her. Then she followed Mr. Dane and Dr. Collins out, the thick hush of the estate swallowing their footsteps. 2 days raced by in a blur. She spent most of that time making arrangements for Oliver, delivering him to Mrs. Chen's apartment, providing phone numbers and a schedule of times she might possibly come home. Oliver didn't cry or beg to come along. He just hugged her tighter than usual as though he sensed some new unspoken distance forming. Hannah tried to keep her own tears at bay, promising to check in whenever she could. Standing on the threshold of the estate once again, now with a single suitcase in hand, she felt an ominous mixture of dread and relief. Relief that she might actually survive financially. Dread at the unknown trials ahead of her, and at the thought of leaving her child behind for who knew how long. She rang the call box, the gates opened and she stepped inside, drawn along the curved driveway like a moth to a cold, indifferent flame. Mr. Dane greeted her in the foyer, instructing one of the house staff to take her suitcase to a bedroom in the eastern wing. Then he led her back to the same large bedroom where she'd first met the man in the wheelchair, now introduced simply as Mr. Whitmore. She found him sitting near the window again, though this time the curtains were mostly drawn, letting in only a thin line of sunlight. He didn't turn around. "You came back," he said, voice quiet. "I said I would." She approached slowly, noticing that his hair was slightly disheveled, and the lines of strain at the corners of his eyes seemed deeper, as if the last 2 days had been as tumultuous for him as they were for her. He rubbed his temple. "I'm not in the mood for questions, Miss Dalton. If you have them, direct them to Dr. Collins. She'll instruct you on any medication or therapy schedules you need to know." Hannah placed a folded sweater over the arm of a nearby chair. "I understand. I'm here to help, not to interrogate you." His laugh was bitter. "Good. Help me to bed then. I can't sit upright anymore this afternoon." Despite the coldness in his tone, she moved forward, carefully offering her arm. He hesitated only a moment before accepting, albeit stiffly. She felt the tension in his body, the subtle tremor in his muscles. Guiding him toward the bed, she was mindful not to make any sudden gestures that could jar him. Mr. Whitmore exhaled shakily as he sank onto the mattress. "You'll get used to this," he said, turning his head so he didn't have to look at her. "I don't want pity or forced optimism. Just do what's necessary. Then leave me be." She nodded, swallowing the pity that threatened to surface anyway. "Of course," she murmured, adjusting the pillows behind him. She could almost feel the weight of his pride bearing down, fueling his resentment at having to rely on her. She recognized the look in his eyes, the same expression some of her former patients wore when they realized their independence was slipping away, day by day. For the remainder of that first evening, she followed Dr. Collins' instructions meticulously, administering medication at set intervals, documenting Mr. Whitmore's vital signs, ensuring he drank enough fluids. The estate staff lingered in the periphery as if curious about how she'd hold up. She tried to ignore their watchful eyes, focusing instead on the man she now had to care for around the clock. He maintained a strained silence, except for curt directions. "Move that footstool. Lift my shoulder higher. Close the curtains all the way." She wondered if he'd ever speak to her willingly, or if this frosty dynamic was simply how things would remain. Late that night, she retreated to her assigned bedroom, exhausted. The walls of her room were a soft cream color, the bed larger than she needed, with crisp linens that felt almost luxurious. And yet, as she lay down, all she could think about was Oliver, imagining him asleep in Mrs. Chen's living room. She turned restlessly, too aware of the hush that blanketed the estate, broken only by the faint echo of footsteps somewhere in the hall. Days began to blur into one another. Each morning, she rose before dawn to check on Mr. Whitmore, help him through stretches recommended by Dr. Collins, and see that he ate a light breakfast. He often insisted on minimal help, though his hands shook when he tried to grip utensils. She learned not to comment on the spilled juice or the occasional clatter of cutlery to the floor. Comments, she realized, only stoked his bitterness, even if she intended them kindly. Occasionally, Dr. Collins would appear, guiding Hannah through more complex tasks. How to position Mr. Whitmore to avoid bed sores, how to manage the medication that controlled his muscle spasms. The doctor's presence brought a sense of structure, but it also heightened tension. Mr. Whitmore would become sullen, sometimes outright snapping at both of them if they fussed too much. Hannah discovered that giving him space afterward helped, though it saddened her to see how quickly his frustration flared. At the end of each day, she retreated to her room, phone clutched in hand, eager to speak with Oliver. The estate's Wi-Fi signal was strong, allowing her quick video calls. Oliver always tried to appear cheerful, proudly showing off some drawing or recounting his day at school. Still, she sensed the loneliness in his voice. Guilt gnawed at her. She reminded herself it was temporary. If she could just stay long enough to gather the funds to clear their debts, maybe they could move somewhere better, even if that took months. One afternoon, as she was guiding Mr. Whitmore's wheelchair through a quiet corridor, he spoke up in a low voice. "You have a child, don't you?" She nearly halted, startled that he'd address her about anything personal. "Yes, a boy. He's 8. He studied the pattern on the floor. Must be hard, staying here full time." Hannah responded carefully. "It's necessary right now, and I know he's safe with someone I trust." He didn't ask more, turning his head toward a portrait of an older man hanging on the wall, as though that subject were closed. But the question lingered in Hannah's mind, fueling a faint hope that perhaps he possessed more empathy than he let on. A week passed, then 2. The routine settled into a steady cadence of medication, meals, therapy sessions, and silent evenings. She began to notice small patterns in Mr. Whitmore's health, how his muscles twitched more in cold weather, how bright light sometimes made him wince as if it triggered headaches. She adjusted quietly, making small accommodations without announcing them. For example, she'd close the curtains early on cloudy days or keep the lights dimmer. She switched out certain heavy utensils for lighter ones that were easier for him to handle. He seemed to notice, though he said nothing. Sometimes she caught a fleeting flicker of appreciation in his eyes, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by guarded detachment. As time wore on, she found that caring for him demanded as much emotional resilience as physical labor. His bitterness could cut like a knife. At times, he refused to cooperate with even the simplest tasks, forcing her to patiently wait until he relented. He never apologized for his sharp words or moody silences, but neither did he forbid her presence. Late into the night, after she had helped him settle, she would linger at the door, watching him stare blankly at the ceiling. The urge to ask what weighed on his mind was strong, but she knew better than to pry. One cold evening she mustered the courage to speak a bit more personally. "Would you like me to turn on some music?" she asked after finishing his evening routine. He frowned. "Music? Sometimes it helps. Pass the time, you know. Drowns out the silence a bit." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Silence doesn't bother me, but do what you want." Surprised by his mild response, she went to a discreetly placed sound system in the corner. She searched the library, finding a few classical compilations. When Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake began to play softly, she was certain he'd protest or laugh at her for the choice. Instead, he closed his eyes. The tension in his jaw eased fractionally, and he let out a long, slow breath. Hannah stayed, perched on a chair in the corner, keeping the volume low. After a while, she thought he might have drifted to sleep, but then he spoke in a voice so soft she barely caught it. "I used to play piano." She leaned forward. "You did?" He opened his eyes, a distant look crossing them. "Stopped after my condition progressed. Couldn't keep up the coordination." The admission came haltingly, as though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. She chose her next sentence carefully. "Piano was something you enjoyed?" He gave a small nod. "My mother made me start as a child. I hated it at first, but eventually, I don't know. The music was mine." He hesitated, as though saying more might cost him. "Now it's just another thing I've lost." The statement hung in the air. She wanted to offer some reassurance, but she sensed that positivity would only ring hollow to him. So instead, she quietly said, "I'm sorry." Then let the music speak for them both. It was the first time he'd shared a genuine piece of himself, and it felt like a delicate bud of trust in a frozen landscape. Time advanced, each day marked by the rhythms of medication, mobility exercises, and halting conversation. She discovered that beneath his harsh exterior lay a man who seemed tormented by regret. His phone rang often, but he seldom answered, letting it go to voicemail. Sometimes she glimpsed the names: lawyers, financial managers, or old colleagues. He refused to see visitors. The staff, presumably used to this reclusiveness, never pressed him on it. One afternoon, while helping him navigate from the bed to the wheelchair, she noticed an old photograph partially tucked under a nightstand. It showed him standing confidently beside a grand piano, wearing a tuxedo, a luminous smile on his face. Another figure, a young woman in an elegant dress, smiled alongside him. Before she could stop herself, Hannah gently lifted it to get a closer look, fascinated by the brightness in his eyes. He caught sight of it and immediately stiffened. "Put that away." She set it down at once, mortified at her intrusion. "I'm sorry." His voice was cold but not cruel. "Just don't." She nodded, swallowing a lump of guilt. It wasn't her place to dig up a past he clearly wanted to keep buried. Yet the image lingered in her thoughts, stirring the question of who he used to be before his condition overshadowed everything. That night, she managed to call Oliver for a few minutes, listening to his breathless excitement about a new friend at school. She tried to relish his stories, but her mind kept wandering back to Mr. Whitmore's haunted expression. She wondered if his family had abandoned him, or if he had pushed them away. The estate itself, for all its grandeur, often felt like a mausoleum. Quiet halls, carefully staged rooms, a staff that functioned like clockwork but displayed little warmth. She noticed occasional dust on certain pieces of furniture, suggesting entire wings went unused. It was as though the house was a giant shell containing only a few living souls, each locked in a private orbit around Mr. Whitmore's needs. Weeks slid by, a subdued dance of fleeting connections and carefully guarded silences. She didn't realize how draining it all was until one morning when Dr. Collins caught her yawning over a cup of tea in the staff kitchen. The doctor raised an eyebrow. "When was your last day off?" Dr. Collins asked. Hannah shrugged, realizing she couldn't recall. "I can handle it," she said, not wanting to seem weak. She needed this job too desperately to risk them thinking she wasn't up to the challenge. Dr. Collins studied her. "You're allowed breaks. Even he can't function without you getting some rest. You should speak with Mr. Whitmore about your schedule." Hannah didn't reply. She doubted Mr. Whitmore would appreciate any discussion about her personal needs. Still, the strain was real. She considered the possibility of hiring a sitter or part-time caretaker for Oliver, but that cost money. Money she wanted to save toward a better future. So she soldiered on, ignoring her own exhaustion. Late one evening, long after she had helped Mr. Whitmore settle into bed, she found herself wandering the library, running her fingers along shelves of books she'd never have time to read. She felt numb, uncertain of who she was becoming in this role. Her phone vibrated, a message from Mrs. Chen with a photo of Oliver asleep on her couch. The text read, "He's fine. Don't worry. Hang in there." Hannah sank into an armchair, tears stinging her eyes. She felt the crushing distance from her son, from the life she used to have, from the person she used to be. The hush of the mansion pressed in. She wondered if Mr. Whitmore was awake, staring at the same darkness, or if he was finding some fleeting respite in sleep. An unspoken tension had begun building between them, one part grudging respect, another part unacknowledged empathy. She saw the way his gaze softened minutely when she entered the room, as though he depended on her presence more than he'd ever admit. Yet he still maintained that aloof barrier, quick to remind her he didn't need her pity. In quiet moments, she found herself wanting to ask about the life he once had. The travels, the music, the dreams. She wanted to know how he'd ended up so alone, with only Dr. Collins, Mr. Dane, and a handful of staff to keep the estate running. But she never dared to push too far, for fear of losing the small measure of trust he'd granted her. One day, while assisting him through a particularly difficult physical therapy session, he suddenly lashed out. The therapy had caused him visible pain, and he snapped about her incompetence, accusing her of aggravating his muscles. Dr. Collins intervened, administering a mild relaxant, and the session ended in frustrated silence. Hannah stayed behind after the doctor left, tidying the room and preparing to help him back to his quarters. She found him still sitting there, fists clenched around the arms of the therapy chair, eyes wet with tears of sheer rage and humiliation. He refused to look at her. She approached cautiously. "I'm sorry," she whispered, even though it wasn't her fault. She recognized that he needed an outlet for his anger. He let out a shuddering breath, tension rolling off him in waves. "Don't. Just don't," he murmured, voice ragged. "I hate this. I hate that this is all my life is now." She gently placed a hand near his shoulder, not quite touching him, just offering her presence. "I know it's hard," she said, struggling to find words that didn't sound trite. "I'm here." He closed his eyes, a faint tremor passing through him. For once, he didn't push her away. The hush in the therapy room seemed to amplify the fragile moment between them, a delicate thread that might snap at any moment. Eventually, he allowed her to wheel him out, shoulders slumped in weary surrender. She felt a pang of understanding. She'd seen the same raw despair in so many patients at the nursing facility, but never so isolated, never so locked behind walls of privilege and self-imposed solitude. This was a man drowning in anger at his own failing body and at a world that no longer bent to his will. Later that night, she helped him into bed. The last pill of the evening was placed in his hand, and she waited with a glass of water. He swallowed it, exhaling shakily. Before she could turn to go, he spoke softly. "Thank you." She froze, uncertain she'd heard him correctly. "For what?" His gaze flicked away, awkward. "Just thank you." She nodded once, giving him a small, understanding smile before leaving. In that moment, the distance between them felt like it had narrowed a fraction. She suspected it might widen again in the morning, but for now, it was enough.